Welcome back, everyone, to Rambling Dan Rose Deep Dive Book Reviews. We're glad to have you with us.
So we're going deep into how software startups and venture capitalists are changing how wars are fought and won.
And how technology really reshapes those dynamics globally.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing that really hit me is how these sources describe like a real disconnect between the Pentagon and Silicon Valley for years. It wasn't just distance, it was this deep cultural thing, right?
Yeah, and you can see that reflected in the fact that no Secretary of Defense even visited Silicon Valley for decades. And this was where the future was being built. Search engines, smartphones, the cloud, these huge innovations were happening. And the Pentagon was basically absent.
It's wild. It's almost like they were operating in parallel universes. The Pentagon, stuck in its old ways, was wary of these fast-moving tech companies, and Silicon Valley saw the government as this slow, bureaucratic customer, not exactly the ideal client for companies built on speed and disruption.
And this disconnect really had consequences, right? Think about it. If commercial technology was leaping ahead, shouldn't the tools for defending the nation keep pace? This gap is what some call the Valley of Death, where promising defense tech products would basically get lost in the bureaucratic maze and never even make it to the battlefield.
That's a powerful image, like potentially life-saving innovations just withering away in this bureaucratic desert. And this Valley of Death wasn't just bad for innovation, it had serious implications for national security. You had the U.S., this global superpower, potentially falling behind in the very technologies that could define future conflicts.
Exactly. And that's where Ash Carter comes in. When he became Secretary of Defense in 2015, he was really the first to grasp this gap and try to bridge it actively. What's fascinating is that he wasn't new to this idea. He actually predicted this way back in 2001, writing about how the military needed to be the world's fastest adapter and adopter of commercial technology.
So he was ahead of the curve, but no one was listening back then. It makes you wonder why there was so much, resistance to this idea that seems, kind of obvious.
The military was used to these massive defense contractors with their long timelines and equally massive budgets. Silicon Valley, it operated at a whole other pace. It'd be like trying to synchronize a symphony orchestra with a punk rock band.
You can see how that would create some friction. And it wasn't just about pace either, right? There is actual mistrust on both sides. Silicon Valley was skeptical of the government's motives, and the military brass doubted if these young techies could even grasp the complexities of warfare.
You got it. And that's where Carter's leadership becomes so important. He knew that just wishing for collaboration wouldn't make it happen. You needed a structure, a system to overcome those barriers.
And that's where we get DIUX, the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, right? This was his baby, an outpost in Silicon Valley meant to connect the Pentagon with the world of startups. But even with Carter's backing, the early days of DIUX, they were anything but smooth sailing. Sounds like they were given this massive task, but with very limited resources and authority.
Yeah, it's like they were given this toolbox with a rusty screwdriver and some pliers and told to build a spaceship. Amazing mandate, bridge the gap, bring in cutting-edge technology, but set up to fail from the start.
So then you have the reluctant heroes coming in, Shah and Kirchhoff leading DIUX 2.0. Their story really shows this mix of idealism and maneuvering through bureaucracy. They were both taking a huge risk, Shah leaving a successful startup, Kirchhoff putting his reputation in Washington on the line.
And they were met with skepticism on both sides, too. Silicon Valley was still iffy about working with the government, and the old guard in the Pentagon, they saw DIUX as a threat to their way of doing things, of course.
Wow, it's amazing they accomplished anything at all. One detail that jumped out at me was the story of those congressional staffers, Evelyn and Ed. They actually tried to completely cut DIUX's budget, saw this tiny unit as some kind of dangerous experiment disrupting the established order.
Perfect example of how bureaucratic systems just resist change. Even when it's, desperately needed, the people who benefit from things staying the same will fight to keep it that way.
But Carter was clearly determined to make DIUX work. He gave them these special superpowers, direct reporting to him, access to funds, and something incredibly powerful, waiver authority, so they could bypass those stifling regulations if it was holding back their mission.
Carter knew to succeed, DIUX needed to be agile, independent, not bogged down by the usual bureaucracy. Brilliant strategy, but even with these superpowers, it was an uphill battle. They had to constantly prove their worth, navigate this minefield of, bureaucratic politics, and get funding for their projects. There's this almost funny anecdote about them needing to use like a credit card workaround to get that initial funding because their official budget wasn't approved yet.
You're kidding. They had to resort to that. It's crazy. They're tasked with this, like, cutting-edge tech that could impact national security, and they're scrounging for funds like a college student. Shows you how even the most important initiatives can get bogged down by red tape.
Yeah, it really speaks to how challenging it is to drive innovation in these big old institutions. And it underscores the dedication of people like Shah and Kirchhoff, who were determined to make DIUX succeed no matter what.
Speaking of proving their worth, one of the first concrete examples of DIUX's success was this tanker app they developed. The story shows like the potential of DIUX and also all the hurdles they had to jump over to realize it.
Yeah, it all started with this, simple observation. They noticed this glaring inefficiency in how the Air Force was scheduling those tanker refueling missions in the Middle East. They're using this old system, whiteboards and manual calculations, to manage something like 70 strike sorties every single day.
70 sorties a day. You'd think with all the technology at their disposal, they'd have something more sophisticated.
You would think, right. And we're not talking about some remote outpost here. This was the CAOC, the Combined Air Operations Center, the heart of the air war. It's almost hard to believe that the most technologically advanced military in the world was using a system that, honestly, wouldn't look out of place in a World War II movie.
Our sources talk about the reaction of Erich Rosenbach, who was chief of staff to the Secretary of Defense at the time. He saw this firsthand and was just floored. He called it the most egregious misuse of IT he'd ever seen.
It really shows how resistant to change things were inside the Pentagon. They were so used to doing things a certain way that they were blind to the potential of just a simple software solution.
Thankfully, DIUX saw that potential and acted fast. They put together a team of coders from Pivotal, a Silicon Valley software company, brought them over to the CAOC to develop this app that could streamline those refueling missions.
They had to get special permission to bring Macs into this secure facility because the coders were used to working on Apple computers.
Wow, special permission for Macs. Really shows the difference in how these two worlds operated.
Exactly. And they had to deal with security protocols, skepticism from the folks who were used to the old ways. But they got it done, and in just a few weeks, they had this working app. And the impact was immediate. General Horigian, who was leading U.S. Air Force's Central Command then, he was really impressed. He said these coders were changing the DNA of the Air Force.
What a testament to their work. But even with this success, they still got pushback from those invested in the old system. Innovation takes more than just a better solution. You got to overcome that inertia from people who benefit from the status quo.
Oh, absolutely. The tanker app was a small win, but it showed DIUX could deliver, a sign that change was possible, but the real test was coming. Their next challenge was even bigger, tackling one of the most pressing national security threats, North Korea.
Okay, now the stakes are getting even higher. We're talking nuclear weapons, rogue states, and a critical intelligence gap that DIUX was about to, step right into.
The U.S. didn't have good satellite coverage over North Korea, especially when it came to keeping tabs on their mobile missile launchers.
So one of the most dangerous regimes in the world was basically operating in a blind spot. That's not a good feeling.
Right. It makes you question that idea that intelligence agencies can see everything, doesn't it? This gap wasn't just a mistake, it was a symptom of a bigger issue. The Pentagon was so reliant on these expensive, custom-made satellite systems.
So focused on these billion-dollar programs, they'd missed a potentially more cost-effective and agile solution, small, commercially available satellites. And that's where DIUX steps in, right? And they find this startup called Capella Space.
Classic example of their mission. Finding innovative solutions out in the commercial world to address those pressing national security needs. Capella Space was developing something pretty revolutionary, miniaturized SAR satellites. SAR stands for Synthetic Aperture Radar, a technology that can see through clouds and darkness, giving you incredibly detailed images.
It's like X-ray vision for intelligence gathering. And the founder of Capella Space, Payam Banazadeh, this brilliant young engineer, had figured out how to make these satellites not only smaller, but more affordable.
It was a potential game changer, exactly what DIUX was looking for. They saw the chance to use these satellites to track those North Korean missile launchers, filling that intel gap. But getting funding for this project, that was a whole other hurdle.
It's hard to believe they had trouble getting funding, especially with how little they were asking for just $15 million.
It sounds tiny compared to the cost of those traditional spy satellites, but they hit resistance. There was this skepticism about relying on a young, untested startup for something so sensitive.
Interesting how the story shows that tension between, like, national security imperatives and the fast-paced world of the free market, isn't it? But even with the challenges, DIUX really believed Capella space was the key to this critical intelligence problem.
Yeah, and their conviction was about to be tested as they entered this maze of bureaucratic maneuvering and political infighting. The story of Capella Space and DIUX's fight to get funding for this potentially game-changing technology, well, it's a story of determination, frustration, and honestly a cautionary tale about how resistant to change things are inside the Pentagon.
So you've got DIUX convinced, right? They think this tiny startup, Capella Space, with their miniaturized SAR satellites, it could be the answer to keeping track of those North Korean missiles. But getting the Pentagon on board with the whole thing, that was a whole nother fight, right?
Totally. It's like they'd found the perfect solution, but couldn't quite figure out how to, make the system work for them. And the whole time, the clock is ticking. North Korea is just moving right along with their nuclear program.
The sources talk about this, like high-level meeting DIUX set up with the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bob Work, and the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Paul Selva. These are the guys who could actually make things happen. You'd think, with national security on the line, a $15 million contract, I mean, a drop in the bucket for the Pentagon, would be a no-brainer.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But this is where you see those bureaucratic antibodies, as Shah and Kirchhoff called them, kick in. The intelligence community was already backing this huge billion-dollar spy satellite program. Funding this little startup, well, that might disrupt that program, ruffle some feathers.
It almost seems backwards, doesn't it? They've got this potentially cheaper, more flexible solution, but the system just doesn't want to change. Was it all about protecting their existing programs, or was there something more going on?
I think it's deeper than that, like a reluctance to admit they maybe missed something, that this small company had a better idea than what the big guys were offering. There's a certain level of, risk aversion that comes with these huge bureaucratic structures.
And then there was also that worry about using a company that could sell its data. Questions about security, who's in control, whether a company with all these different customers could really put national security first.
That's a big one, for sure. It shows this fundamental tension, right? Integrating commercial technology, which is all about being open and accessible, with national security, which is often, secretive. That's a question that's only going to get more important as technology keeps evolving.
So while the Pentagon is wrestling with all these concerns, North Korea isn't exactly sitting around. The Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Marcel Letter, expressed serious worry about North Korea maybe testing an ICBM that could hit the U.S.
Now, the stakes are really getting high. It shows how these tech decisions, they weren't just theoretical. And in this classified setting, Letter even mentioned a pretty scary possibility, a preemptive strike on North Korea to stop that test from happening.
That's a lot to think about. It really shows how important these decisions are. But meanwhile, while all this is going on, DIUX is fighting a different battle on a different front. Congress, remember Evelyn and Ed, the staffers who wanted to wipe out their budget?
Oh yeah, them. Seems they managed to tie the Capella space funding to a bigger reprogramming request, meaning now it needs congressional approval. Classic tactic, using procedure to stall or even kill something you don't like. Suddenly, DIUX is back in the hot seat, having to defend this relatively small contract in what sounds like a pretty hostile hearing.
The sources describe this grueling 3-hour hearing where they get grilled by skeptical lawmakers. Must have been a tough reminder that innovation isn't just about the tech itself. It's also about navigating, Washington politics.
Yeah, it's a whole other battlefield. But they did have one powerful ally on their side, Senator John McCain. Known for being tough on defense waste and inefficiency, he saw DIUX as a potential solution, a way to bring in new tech fast and challenge how things are done. And Shah, well, he did something pretty bold, something very Silicon Valley. He went straight to McCain, bypassing all the usual channels.
That sounds like a gamble, but it seems like it paid off.
It did. McCain was impressed with Shah's vision, and he came out publicly, pledging his support to help get them funded. Big win, but not the end of the fight. The Capella space contract was still up in the air, facing pushback from inside the intelligence community.
And here's where it gets really frustrating. Even with how urgent things were, even with McCain's support, the money for Capella Space was delayed, caught up in all this infighting and bureaucratic turf wars.
You really feel that frustration in the book. They point to the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, O'Sullivan, as a key figure in this delay. Looks like she was worried that funding Capella would, undermine the existing spy satellite program, the one she was backing.
So the system that's meant to protect national security is, in this case, actually preventing them from using potentially game-changing technology. That's got to be incredibly frustrating for the folks at
I
DIUX.
can't imagine. And the result? Capella Space had to go find funding somewhere else, eventually partnering with a commercial imagery company. The Pentagon missed out on being an early adopter of this, potentially groundbreaking tech. A classic example of how bureaucracy, that slowness to change, can really stifle innovation, even when the stakes are so high.
Tough lesson. But it sounds like Capella Space did all right for themselves, despite this setback. They launched their satellites, became a major player in the commercial space industry.
While DIUX was fighting these bureaucratic battles, a new wave of defense tech startups was on the rise. Companies like Palantir and Endural, determined to disrupt the industry from the inside. They weren't waiting for permission, they were forging their own path. The Capella Space story, it really makes you think, doesn't it? Not just about the obstacles DIUX had to face, but this bigger shift happening at the same time. While they were battling bureaucracy, a whole new wave of defense tech startups was popping up. Companies like, Palantir and Dural, founded by people who seemed, determined to shake things up.
Yeah, these weren't your typical Silicon Valley startups chasing the next big app, right? They were taking on these huge national security challenges, counterterrorism, cyber warfare, things that had always been handled by those massive defense contractors.
And it's the mindset of these founders that gets me. They weren't afraid to challenge the way things had always been done, push the limits of what was possible. They saw technology as a way to, like, give the U.S. a real edge in a world that was getting more and more complicated.
Anduril is a perfect example, right? One of their founders was Palmer Luckey, the guy who made Oculus VR, the thing Facebook bought for billions. It's like something out of a movie, this young tech genius who wants to disrupt this whole slow-moving industry.
Lucky he's like the poster child for that Silicon Valley disruptor. And Anduril, they didn't waste any time. They were in the headlines with projects like counter-drone systems and those AI-powered surveillance towers. Cutting-edge stuff, like right out of sci-fi. But they were building it for real.
And it wasn't just for show either. These systems, they were being used like in actual operations. Anduril was proving that startups could deliver, and they were doing it fast, leaving those old defense giants behind.
Their growth was incredible. Billion-dollar contracts, attracting top talent, really shaking things up. The whole defense tech landscape was changing, and fast.
And then you can't forget about the war in Ukraine, which became this real-world test for so many of the ideas DIUX had been pushing. It was like all these theoretical discussions suddenly got very, very real.
Ukraine was a turning point for sure. You had the Ukrainians up against this much bigger, better equipped enemy, and they turned to commercial technology to even the odds. Drones, satellite imagery, Starlink internet, AI-powered targeting systems, they were using it all in some really innovative ways.
It was amazing how quickly they adapted, how they integrated all this new tech, using it in ways that surprised even the experts.
One of the best examples is that Uber for artillery system. They basically took the Uber app and modified it to coordinate artillery strikes, allowing forward observers to call in targets and direct fire with incredible precision.
It's wild how they were able to just take existing technology and use it for the military like that. And it wasn't just apps. They were using those off-the-shelf drones for surveillance, dropping grenades, even taking out tanks. Talk about an advantage.
Yeah, Ukraine was a wake-up call for the Pentagon. It showed that the future of warfare, it's being shaped by how fast commercial technology is changing. Being able to adapt quickly, to be agile and innovative, that became essential in a fight where the enemy was constantly changing their tactics.
So, where do we go from here? What does all this mean for the future of warfare? It seems like the line between the commercial world and the military world is getting blurrier all the time. The same things that are part of our everyday lives are now being used on the battlefield.
Exactly, and that means organizations like DIUX, they're more important than ever. They need to keep bridging that gap, finding those innovative solutions, and helping the Pentagon keep up with this rapidly changing landscape. But it's not just about the tech, it's about the people. We need leaders who understand both how powerful technology can be and how complex warfare really is.
It feels like we need to be having some serious conversations as a country about what this tech revolution really means. We can't just assume that progress is always a good thing. We have to think critically about the potential consequences, good and bad, of the things we create.
I couldn't agree more. And that's really what this whole deep dive has been about, giving you the information, the different viewpoints, so you can understand these complex issues, ask the right questions, and be a part of the conversations that will shape our future.
We've gone through a lot today, from the start of DIUX to these new defense tech startups popping up and the impact of the Ukraine war It's been quite a ride.
It really has. And the pace of change, well, it doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon, so it's more important than ever to stay informed and engaged.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.